And a Fox News alert. I'm Leland Vittert in New York, 9 p.m. Eastern, and we are just a little bit more than 2 hours into a large-scale power outage in parts of New York City. Traffic lights have been knocked out. Subway service shut down on a busy Saturday night. As we look live at Times Square, you can see there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of people out on the street who would not normally be there. A number of the theaters on Broadway have quite literally gone dark with this power outage, sending people out into the streets. The normally lit up New York City skyline now dark in so many places, so many of those buildings dark except for their emergency lights. We are going to take a look up 6th Avenue, which would normally be packed with cars. It is now packed with people and empty with cars as police have shut down a number of the intersections to allow the fire department to get through to the some 44,000 customers without power. And when we say 44,000 without power, that's customers. That could be a single building without power and people stuck in the elevator. The New York Fire Department saying that they are dealing with multiple reports, they say, of people stuck in elevators across the Upper West Side and of Midtown Manhattan. There is not panic on the streets, but there are a lot of people on the streets. There is a lot of confusion on the streets as restaurants and theaters and even some hotels have told people simply to walk out of their establishments. And you can see now as we look up 6th Avenue, indeed, a city shut down, crippled, if you will, here on a very busy, packed summer Saturday night in New York, and it is hot outside. We are told that there are countless folks trapped in underground subway cars, elevators as well. And with that, we bring in Bill Stanton, former NYPD police officer and safety and security expert, joining us now. Bill, obviously, you have a plan for everything when you're the NYPD. What is the plan for this, and what's happening now at blackout plus 2 hours?
Well, right now they do. They have contingency plans working with all other emergency services, EMT, fire department, etc. Obviously, first thing, safety and security for the folks that have medical issues that need power. This is where, the citizens of New York, working with the city agencies, all need to come together, even if it's old school, knocking on your elderly neighbor's door that might have a medical device that requires power. All these things need to come into play to keep us all safe and secure.
We've heard from the police, and we see some of New York's finest now out directing traffic as so many of the streetlights have shut down. We've heard from the police and the fire department, do not call 911 unless it is a true emergency, because they've had such a spike in phone calls. And oftentimes we've seen this before. We saw it in the last blackout here in New York, that times like this brings together a city in a unique way and brings out really the best in everybody. How long does it take for the NYFD, NYPD to begin to clear these buildings and start to clear out a number of these elevators and subways where folks are stuck?
Well, since it is a weekend, they can eliminate for the large part, the office buildings. So just thank God a lot of the office buildings, the elevators are generally empty right now. It's a real tough call to answer. It's a good question, but a tough one to answer because we only have so many officers and members of the FDNY, and there's a lot of buildings in New York City. So it's incumbent upon people, if they're in elevators and they're listening to this now on their phone, to stay calm and just know help is on the way.
Well, stay calm, and you say that, although it is hot, it is dark in a lot of these places. You can imagine just how stifling it would be stuck on a subway car. The image we have right now is of Times Square. We're going to switch it to our 6th Avenue camera, which looks up 6th Avenue towards Central Park, and you'll notice that even the sign for Radio City Music Hall is dark. Bill, you've been here for a long time. Have you been here for that to happen?
I'm sorry?
Have you ever seen that happen with the Radio City Music Hall gone dark and 6th Avenue empty?
No, never. I was a teenager in '77. It was a different time, but I've never seen Radio City go dark. No.
Yeah, Bill, we're going to ask you to stand by for a second. Jackie Heinrich out on the streets of Midtown Manhattan and joining us. Jackie, as I walked up, there were huge crowds. There was confusion, but there didn't seem to be the kind of panic that you would expect of people in the middle of a city now dark.
Yeah, Leland, obviously a different scene than for those folks who might be in elevators or stuck underground in subway stations that don't have service right now. On the street here in Midtown Manhattan, people are actually kind of enjoying it. You've seen that some of the Broadway shows brought their concerts out onto the street. The cast of Waitress did the rest of their show, and a Carnegie Hall concert actually moved out onto the street. You can see that some of New York's finest are directing traffic, and people are getting along just the best they can, managing. The sun's gone down, so it's a little bit cooler. I'm here with a street vendor, Sharif. We were talking earlier, if you come over this way, just about where you were when the lights went dark, and you said that people were a little bit startled, but not panicked.
Yes, it happened 6:30. I try to meet somebody in the store here, and when we go inside the store, we see dark area and the store is shut down, and nobody can sell or buy anything. And today, anyway, very traffic in the 6th Avenue because...
And you're lucky tonight because you're running, I don't know if you can pan around with me, Jeremy, one of your street carts. You're a street vendor, so cash is king on a night like this. Although restaurants are shut down and people can't pay their bills at some of the areas that don't have power in Midtown and the Upper West Side, people are turning to you and other vendors who might use the cash apps or Square cards to make their transactions. And have you had a lot of folks who are hungry and maybe had to abandon their dinner plans come over to see you?
Yeah, whatever the people need to buy, I can sell all the food for the people because I see all the stores closed, and we try to help the customers.
Thank you so much, Sharif. And as you saw, some of the stores that were unable to close their metal barricades, that was one of the inconveniences for some of these areas that didn't have power. Some of those electrically generated closures saw folks at the Gap right across the street trying to pull down one of those metal barricades that you would normally just press a button to close. So those are some of the kinds of things that are happening here. So far, no reports of any injuries. Saw the last update from the fire department in New York saying that they were trying to get a hold on the transformer fire at the station, I believe it was in the 50s, but no injuries reported associated with that. And at the last update, the New York City subway system advising people just avoid underground subway stations and use buses if you can. As you can see behind me, traffic is moving. It's just being directed by hand from some of New York City's finest. And as you can see, the street lights are out. So right now, folks are just doing the best they can and waiting for the lights to come back on. And in the meantime, enjoying a simpler time, I guess. Leland?
Yeah, as you pointed out, Jackie, there's a lot of things we take for granted that you press a button, you expect to happen, and now without power, that is not happening. Right now, we are told that it was a transformer fire that has started this cascading effect across much of the Upper West Side of New York City. Now, 44,000 customers without power, but in New York, a customer can be an entire building, so that's why you're seeing, as we look up 6th Avenue, part of it free and void of cars. You can see some of the crosstown traffic moving. As Jackie pointed out, you had New York's finest directing traffic by hand. Jackie, wanted to ask you, in the minutes of this happening, and you were still here at the office, as you walked downstairs and then outside for this, was there panic? What was the general feel in those first couple of minutes? Was it fear? Give us an emotion.
Not at all. Folks are taking pictures. They're tweeting about it. They're talking to each other and sharing their experiences of where they were when the lights went out, whether they had to abandon their plans, whether they got out of their cab or left the place that they were headed to because they found out that their evening plans had been foiled. So more amusement than anything. Of course, want to be respectful of the people who are right now stuck in elevators and at some point might have been stuck in a subway tonight. We do know that rescues were happening on the west side of Manhattan. The fire department tweeting that they were doing at one point, responding to hundreds of calls for potential rescues for people who'd been trapped. But out on the street, people who are not trapped, they're not having a terrible time. They're smiling, they're looking at each other, they're tweeting. I believe the hashtag blackout was trending at one point on Twitter when I was still in the building. And at the moment that the lights went out a couple hours ago now, it was a little bit of a different scene. Folks were kind of wondering what was going on. You heard big announcements, even in our own building at 1211 Avenue of the Americas, corner of 6th and 48th Street. While I was in the studio ready to do my live shot, an announcement came in over our very own intercom telling folks who were working in the building that the elevators were down. We knew about, folks who might be trapped on floors. Here's the number that you call. And a lot of major businesses were doing that as well. Right. AMC movie theater up in Lincoln Square evacuated everybody, said, sorry, you don't get to see your show tonight. Go ahead and proceed out into the street. And I think at that point there was a little bit more confusion, but people have cell phones these days. They know what's going on. They know it's a transformer fire that spurred this, and that so far there hasn't been any information as to any wider threat coming from any of our city officials. Nothing for people to be concerned about, just more interested in when things are going to get back going. And I think the businesses who are losing money tonight are probably having the worst time of it, but for regular folks in the street, they're just talking to their neighbors and sharing their experiences about where they were when it all happened.
Yeah, and then trying to get home. You noted, Jackie, the hashtag blackout. It was 42 years ago tonight of the massive blackout in 1977. They didn't have a hashtag back then, but they were certainly talking about it. Jackie's going to be out on the street talking to some folks. We're going to check back in with her here as the New York Police Department continues to try to get traffic moving. We saw a number of the signal lights out, and that's why as we look up 6th Avenue, it's void of so many of the cars. As you look at your television screen, you'll also notice it's a little grainier than normal when we look at this shot up 6th Avenue, and that is because it is so dark. We've had to have the cameras gain up and sort of open their iris to try and give you a view of just how dark it is. This now looking in to Times Square. Some of the billboards are still light, but if you look in what is the upper left-hand corner of your screen, that was a billboard that should be lit up. People pay thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars a day for that billboard, and it is dark tonight, and you can see the streets packed with people, and what cars are allowed on the streets are quite literally crawling along. I want to bring in Joe Borelli, who is a New York City councilman, with the latest on this from his perspective. We know that there is a blackout from about the mid-70s down to the mid-50s or so on the west side of Manhattan. Give us a status report now, 2.5 hours into this. Joe, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. The producer spoke over it. Yeah, I mean, we thankfully we have a very robust Office of Emergency Management, and of course the FDNY and the NYPD, who are going to divert the resources they need. A lot of people don't realize this, but the fire department has close to 300 fire companies working 24/7, and they will be diverting resources from divisions in the other boroughs towards Manhattan to start answering some of the high volume of 911 calls. I mean, people are trapped in an elevator, and they're not really sure whether there's a real emergency or not a real emergency, so they're calling 911, and the volumes have spiked. But thankfully, this is something that the city's Office of Emergency Management prepares for and plans for, and they will be rolling out extra buses and getting people to where they need to go and keeping people safe.
Yeah, so much of New York moves around on the subway. We're hearing stories of people trapped underground. That means in the dark and without air conditioning for over an hour from when this started until now. So many of the subway lines are shut down. Any information on if people are still trapped in the subways, or has that all been cleared?
Yes, the last I heard was that the trains were brought to the nearest station, and then people had the option of exiting, which I assume most people did do.
You think that? No kidding.
Yeah, I mean, well, you never know. I mean, sometimes trains do stop, and you give it a few minutes, and then they start again. But this is, of course, a much more serious situation than the normal sort of the subway problem that sometimes plagues New York. But, you really got to feel for people in Midtown who are trying to be in Manhattan with their families for a night out, trying to use the restaurants, see a Broadway show, just get some fresh air with their friends and family. And, it's going to be a significant economic impact.
Right.
But Leland, we're also not talking about the big question of where is Mayor de Blasio? I don't mean to get political, but when he announced he's running for president,
I think we'll leave politics at the water's edge, or at least at the blackout edge, for a moment here. But you bring up a good point here in terms of the economic impact of this. As we look back at Times Square, so many of the billboards are dark there in Times Square. That's tens of thousands of dollars a day that are being lost, and also. You mentioned, and I want to get back to the issue of the FDNY, bringing in other crews from the other boroughs to do elevator rescues and the like. As we look up 6th Avenue, many of the avenues that run north to south in Manhattan have been shut down by the police departments. Is that to allow these extra FDNY crews and extra rescue crews into the city? Is that part of a plan and a contingency that's already there, or is it made up as it goes along?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're going to divert all traffic away from the intersections that don't have functioning traffic lights. The city has a huge gridlock problem, as you're probably aware, and many of the folks watching are probably aware. So to have this many cars on a street and multiple streets without any type of traffic, signaling is a huge problem. So the first thing the police are going to do is start moving traffic out of the area that's affected.
Well, in a way, if you look back to 42 years ago tonight, the blackout of 1977, this is different in the sense that it's a lot more isolated. This was one transformer that burned, not to diminish the effect on the hundreds of thousands of people who have been either inconvenienced or stuck or are still stuck in elevators, but it's not like the entire city of New York is blacked out and we have to have people walking across bridges for miles to get out of the city.
Right. And there will be resources brought to people should they need. I'm sure the city will open cooling centers as they do sometimes when days get pretty hot. We're also, we can't look at hindsight, though. I mean, we don't know how long this will take for Con Ed to restore the power. It could be hours. It could be, perhaps a day. So things that went wrong in the blackout 4 decades ago, we're not out of the woods yet. I don't want to say that just because people are outside singing and dancing and if you look at Twitter right now, you'll see a lot of people having fun with this blackout, but that may not be the case should this go on for multiple hours. Yeah,
you bring up a very good point that for the first couple of hours, it's a novelty, it's interesting, it's fun. People buy a couple bottles of water and walk around and talk to each other. It's 9:15 Eastern time in New York right now, and you can imagine at 11, 12, 1 a.m. when people would like to be at home, when you've got kids who are at home with babysitters, when you have kids who want to get home to air conditioning, when you have older folks who are hot and miserable on the streets, that things could change pretty quickly. Any idea, as we're looking right now at a live picture, and I'm going to get our producers to let me know where this is, where there's police tape up and we see a lot of New York police officers heading in. This is the transit center in New York City. So this is where the transformer was. Is that what I understand? Okay, this is where the transformer blew that is now cordoned off, and it is dark everywhere around there, and it looks like it's dark for blocks and blocks as our cameraman pans around there. This is on the west side of Manhattan. Do you have any sense, Joe, as you've talked to Con Ed and worked on the various contingency plans of this, do they have backups? Are they able to switch transformers, or is this a situation where you could have a power outage for a couple of days until they can rebuild this thing?
Well, I mean, there's so many different things that can go wrong, so it would be difficult to assume it's one and not the other. But sometimes we've seen cases where Con Ed has brought in, portable generators. Again, I'm not sure how big this really is in magnitude, so it's tough to say whether Con Ed has the capacity to bring portable generators should that be needed.
Yeah.
It's
important to note for our viewers, this is on the very west side of Manhattan, between 70th Street and 50th Street. And if we do a split screen from where the transformer actually blew, it is totally dark with the exception of emergency lights. Each one of these 8, 9, 10, 12-story buildings has elevators. You conceivably have people trapped in any, if not all of those buildings. It is pitch black on that street with the exception of just a couple of emergency lights and the emergency responders. The right-hand side of your screen is looking up 6th Avenue, where there are a few more lights in some of the high-rises that have generators, have emergency power systems, et cetera, but still no traffic lights, et cetera. For folks who don't live in Manhattan, Joe, and don't live in New York, maybe only have visited a couple of times, give us a sense of the difference here of just a couple of streets of going from Midtown and Times Square that people will think of as New York City to where folks actually live and don't have any of the emergency backups that something like Times Square does.
Right. Most of the buildings in central Midtown will have their own generators, will have fire suppression officers in the building on duty 24/7. Once you go to the west in a neighborhood like Hell's Kitchen, where most of the buildings are 4 stories, 5 stories, and mostly residential, that's where you're going to frankly find the real New Yorkers who are just living and eating and breathing.
Right.
And that's where you're going to find most of the problem tonight, because people are going to be stuck in their upper-level apartments without air conditioner, in poorly ventilated buildings. I mean, some of these buildings were tenements from the early 20th century and late 19th century. So these are conditions that we wouldn't normally see since the advent of air conditioning. And people are going to be, unfortunately, very, very hot. It's going to be very difficult, and older people are going to have a very hard time.
Joe, you bring up a very good point in terms of the heat out here. Joe, we're going to let you get back to your job as a city commissioner. I know you've got constituents to look after. We appreciate you joining us, and we will check back in with you throughout the night. We're now about 2.5 hours into this blackout between 50th Street and 70th Street on the west side of Manhattan. And you're looking now at one of the more iconic parts of Manhattan, Times Square, where you can see folks on the streets, very few cars. The cars that are being allowed through by the New York Police Department have to be directed quite literally by hand at every intersection, because all of the street lights, the signal lights and traffic lights are out. Joe talked about the heat in New York. It is right now 85 degrees, heat index of 86 degrees. So if people are stuck underground in subways, as they were for at least an hour, or in the upper floors of apartment buildings or in elevators, it is going to begin to get very uncomfortable very quickly. And with that, we bring in Bernard Kerik, former NYPD commissioner who was through the tragedies and the terrible times of 9/11 as the NYPD commissioner, and now joins us live. Commissioner, you have to think, and you would know and can tell us more about it, the contingency plans that the New York Police Department, the New York Fire Department have for times just like this.
Well, listen, that's why the Office of Emergency Management was created back in 1996, which will be the primary, event coordinator for something like this. The fire department has a job to do, the police department has a job to do, and the primary coordinator is going to be OEM, or the Office of Emergency Management.
Take us through what each group is doing. As we're watching, we have a crew down at the site of where this transformer blew, and it is pitch black, save emergency crews, a lot of NYPD crews down there, and then FDNY as well. Take us through sort of from blackout happening through now, what is each agency doing?
Well, first of all, there's policies and protocols and plans in place for the response. So, the precincts, the fire stations, they're going to dispatch all their people. There'll be lighting mechanisms. The police department has thousands of these generator lights that they're going to have to get up and out. The fire department is going to be doing a lot of pulling people out of buildings. They get stuck in elevators or, the high-rise rescues, so to speak. I'd advise people, open your windows, stay where you are. You don't want to overheat in a circumstance like this. And let the first responders do their job.
Bernie, what do you make of the fact we're getting, as we look at the FDNY and NYPD Twitter accounts and hearing from them as well, we're awaiting a 9:45 press conference. That's 20 minutes from now at the command center for all of this, as they take a look at why this transformer blew and then how long it's going to take to restore power to all these folks. As we talk through this, we're hearing from NYPD and FDNY who say, look, we know the power's out. Don't call 911 unless it is a true emergency. And if people are in an elevator listening to this, if they're at their home listening to this, what is that line when they say unless it's a true emergency? What constitutes a true emergency at a time like this?
If it's something that's a danger to a person, physical danger, power lines possibly, health issues. If it's not that, then don't flood the 911 or the 311 lines because these guys, it's really busy right now. And just stay stationary. Listen for the broadcast if you can. There's no telling on how long it's going to take this thing to get back up and running. And the less focus, the less push you have on the police department's networks, the better off they are because
we're just getting some information in
from
the Metropolitan Transit Authority that's on our screen. The power outages affected service on the A, C, B, D, F, and M lines as we read the lower thirds and the information coming in from the MTA. For people who've never been to New York City or only been a couple of times, when you shut down that many subway lines in New York City, obviously we had folks trapped for a while. We understand that most of them, if not all, have been pulled out, some after more than an hour. But when you shut down that many subway lines, what does that mean for this city?
Well, it means a lot because those lines are going to be impacted all over the city, not just in the downtown area. The downtown area, that area from 75th down to 57th or 50th, naturally, that's the impact zone, but it's going to have an impact on the rest of the city. And not only for the subway lines, water lines, electricity, all that stuff that's now down is going to have a negative impact. So the less activity there is, the better, to let the first responders get out there and do what they have to do.
So as we're looking up 6th Avenue right now, and it is completely shut down of cars and any kind of traffic going north and south. Give us the reasoning for that. Is that to allow emergency crews and fire crews coming in from the rest of Manhattan to move north and south in New York? What's the contingency plan? How does that work?
The first responders are going to need basically a flow point, and that's probably what they've designated now as the flow point, the tube to get north and south. A lot of these streets, because there's no lights, you're going to have mass chaos if people, if they're out on the street trying to drive. So the first responders, they're going to block off certain areas where they can get in and out quickly.
And then we look at Times Square, and there's no cars because there are quite literally tens of thousands of people out in the streets that have been pushed out by the theaters and the restaurants who moved everybody out in the middle of this. We heard some restaurants sending people out and just saying, don't worry about the check, just leave in the midst of these blackouts. Folks trapped in the elevators. Not to in any way diminish the seriousness of this. We've got 45,000 customers, which means hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people without power, folks in the streets, a lot of issues. But as we think about a blackout from 50th Street to 70th Street, from 6th Avenue over to the west side, it would seem as though this is a more manageable situation than when we had the blackout back a couple of years ago of the entire Northeast and people were walking out across the Brooklyn Bridge.
Right. Well, listen, it's going to be manageable, but people have to realize if you can get home, if you can get to where you need to be, get out of the way. Get out of that specific area because the things that are down in that area, they will ultimately have an impact on the rest of the city, especially mass transit. So the quicker you can get out of that general area, the better off you're going to be.
Bernie, what are you, in 2.5 hours into this, now 2 hours and 45 minutes, what would you expect the New York Police Department, the Office of Emergency Management, et cetera, to know? What are they ruling in? What are they trying to rule out, perhaps most importantly, in terms of cause, effect? What are they trying to guard against possibly happening next? What are they worried about?
Well, the initial thing is going to be what happened, why it happened, what happened, and how did they prevent it from spreading? That's going to be a big one. This is pretty much contained right now to the upper west side, You don't want it to spread. You don't want it to have any impact on other areas that actually have power. So the faster they can determine what happened, how, and why, the better off they're going to be, just to make sure there's nothing going to spread.
Bernie, we're going to ask you to stand by for us here at 9:30 Eastern. For those of you just joining us, as we look at the New York City skyline, much of it is dark. As we look down at ground level where a transformer blew on the west side of Manhattan, it is entirely pitch black. We look up 6th Avenue, and as Bernard Carrick told us, formerly of the NYPD, the commissioner, this is one of the main thoroughfares that police have shut down to allow the New York Fire Department and the New York Police Department to move in a mass number of crews and flood this area of 50th Street to 70th Street from 6th Avenue to the West Side Highway because of a massive power outage. Con Ed, the power company here, saying they believe that a transformer blew, an underground transformer fire blew, and that has caused this crippling power outage. There are parts of the city that are totally dark, including the famed Radio City Music Hall sign as we look up 6th Avenue, as we look to Times Square. A number of the billboards that are so famous in Times Square are now dark, but there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people on the street. And you might consider those on the streets on a Saturday, summer Saturday in New York City when it's 86 degrees still at 9:30, the lucky ones. There were people caught in subways for an hour or more in the sweltering heat underground until they could move the trains to the stations. You can see traffic in Times Square at a snarl as people have flooded out into this. We're also told a number of the theaters on Broadway quite literally went dark and told people simply to leave. Show's over and get out, as they have such a issue with being able to keep people safe inside those theaters. Restaurants told diners, don't worry about the check and get out as well. Sometimes these situations bring out the worst in people. Oftentimes they bring out the best. We're going to focus on the best that this has brought out in people, as we have seen so many people talking to each other, trying to help each other. Just look at some of the hotels in New York City where every window in these hotels is black. We bring in Jackie Heinrich, who is on the streets of New York City now, 2 hours and 45 minutes into this blackout. We're awaiting an update in about 15 minutes. Jackie, as you've talked to people, give us a sense. Are they calm about this? Has the annoyance factor stepped in?
You know, not quite yet. I think that might happen tomorrow. Hopefully this is restored by then.